Part 1. Laying the Foundation. The 5 Market Influencers. Bargaining Power of Suppliers. Now, it is time to turn our eyes downstream and take a look at the bargaining power that suppliers bring to the table. For many LSPs, this will be a refreshing change of pace, moving the discussion from one of relative impotence to one of power. CLPs may get upset by this section, as it basically outlines how your customers can work to push your prices down, which is surely an existing source of frustration for you. CLPs generally do not have a supply chain. They are the supply chain. Regardless, we think the topics covered in this section will be insightful for anybody, not just vendor managers. There are many factors affecting the bargaining power of suppliers. In this section, we take a closer look at some of them, as listed below. Degree of differentiation. Impact of inputs on cost and differentiation. Presence of substitute inputs. Supplier concentration. Employee solidarity. For example, labor unions. Competition with suppliers. Degree of differentiation. Differentiation here refers to the degree to which a product or service can be distinguished to make it stand out from products or services offered by competitors. Differentiation adds unique value that cannot be easily reproduced by other companies, thus providing a competitive advantage. When it comes to LSPs, they must differentiate based on their ability to execute core functions. Let's say that an MLSP contracts with 2 different types of suppliers to perform the language services requested by their customers. For some projects, they contract directly with CLPs, and for some others, they contract through smaller SLSPs. At the end of the day, what our MLSP is purchasing from both of these suppliers is the same, translations. But it pays the SLSPs a higher rate because of the higher degree of differentiation of their services through their core functions. Another word for differentiation here is value. Differentiation is how LSPs add value to the language services value chain. CLPs, on the other hand, provide only translations, and there is no additional project management, vendor management, or consulting. If the CLPs have been working on their projects for a long time, they can create a level of differentiation for themselves in that they have more experience with the work than others. However, an experienced MLSP works to reduce this power by carefully managing knowledge through standard methods like using translation memories, glossaries, and style guides. It also thoroughly documents any project-specific information so that it can easily be shared with new CLPs should they need to be replaced. The SLSPs, on the other hand, provide project management support to make sure projects are delivered on time. They manage schedules so that when translators are out sick or on vacation, there are backup translators already available. They provide a single point of contact to the MLSPs to cut down the time needed to manage multiple CLPs. Each of these additional services gives the SLSP another way to provide more value and therefore a higher degree of differentiation to the services they're offering. Higher value service offerings, in turn, increase bargaining power. Our MLSP will have a harder time replacing high-value SLSPs. For most MLSPs in this situation, the decision to work with SLSPs is a calculated trade-off. MLSPs are perfectly happy to sacrifice bargaining power for the added value that the SLSPs bring to the table. Any MLSP who has ever had to work directly with hundreds or even thousands of translators knows this very well. Impact of inputs on cost and differentiation. Market prices in the industry are set by supply and demand curves and are very stable over any very short period of time. It is very hard for suppliers to have any impact on overall costs. If our MLSP is to decrease their total cost so that they can enjoy a higher margin, or perhaps lower their prices for the clients, they must cut those costs that don't impact their suppliers. While suppliers may make up the majority of cost for an MLSP, their rates remain quite stable and have very little impact on total cost fluctuations. When our MLSP goes to the negotiation table with their suppliers, generally everybody knows what the market price is. This effectively takes away the supplier's ability to increase their prices, especially in the absence of any significant differentiation of their services. So in this regard, the supplier's bargaining power is actually decreased. On the other hand, though, it takes away any power the MLSP has to drive prices down below the current market price. The MLSP knows just as well as the supplier that they are not going to get a better rate if they talk to other suppliers. If another supplier is able to give a better rate, it is probably because they are cutting corners in other areas, and it will end up costing them the same in the long run. Supplier Solidarity. When we discuss solidarity in the context of market influencer evaluation for other industries, we would refer to organized labor forces. They are able to combine their influence and increase their collective bargaining power with their employers or customers. However, in the highly decentralized and competitive language services industry, it would be hard to imagine any such supplier solidarity could exist. Still, it would be a mistake to disregard supplier solidarity completely when performing market analyses. So let's look at the types of solidarity that we see in the language services industry, starting with the effect of government and cultural view on labor. We then look at how communities have organically organized within the industry, as well as some examples of formal organization. Cultural attitudes. Different cultures have different views on work and labor, and these views are often codified into law by local governmental labor agencies. Because specific services in the industry are linked directly to location, this can lead to an unintended yet powerful form of solidarity among suppliers. Anybody who has ever managed Chinese translations is surely familiar with the Chinese New Year. We are also used to it that we hardly ever stop to think about how big of an irregularity this is, but let's take a moment to appreciate the significance here. Every year, translators, project managers, engineers, and all other types of suppliers in China basically tell their customers that they will be performing no work for a whole week. In China. This is a country that is more than willing to work 24 hours a day for the remainder of the year. Under normal circumstances, they may as well just copy their resignation letters into their out-of-office replies before leaving for such a holiday. But because this is a cultural norm that is also supported by the local government, Chinese suppliers have an extremely high degree of bargaining power, and everybody else in the world has to just accept this and work around it. Likewise, any LSP project manager who has ever tried to get a French translator to work over the weekend has surely been rejected more than a few times. For another language, this may lead the project manager to fire the translator and search for somebody with a more, quote-unquote, American work ethic. However, it is common knowledge that French culture lends itself to a certain degree of solidarity on the subject of overtime hours. Although they are not organizing intentionally, they nonetheless stand united on this point, giving them the bargaining power to negotiate working hours and vacation time that would not be granted to a less galvanized labor force. Organic communities. Because most translations happen at the CLP level, one would think that there would be very little collaboration between individual translators, especially since the market is so competitive with many different suppliers competing with one another. However, there are in fact a number of resources available for CLPs that allow them to share their experience in organized communities with each other. These have largely developed organically and are not often incredibly sophisticated, but they serve to provide a level of organization that would otherwise not be available to CLPs. One feature available to members of online communities is the ability to rate the different LSPs and LSBs they have contracted with. CLPs can create an account, log in, and make comments on their experience working with different companies for CLPs to read. It's basically like Yelp, but for the language services industry. If you are a CLP who has been contacted by an LSP for a big job, most likely your first step would be to go check their score. You may read that they have a bad reputation and don't pay their suppliers on time, or that they are very unorganized and waste your time or don't follow through on their commitments to suppliers. This information leads to informed decisions about whether or not to engage with them, and if so, what rates to charge. If they have a poor reputation, then you may still choose to engage with them, but will charge higher rates in order to cover the additional risk. Likewise, if a company has a great relationship and always pays on time, you may lower your rates to be a little bit more competitive. These organic communities are even more effective depending on the size of your market. For a market with a lot of supply, like English to Spanish translation, it is very difficult for such communities to have any influence on the industry as a whole. However, for a market with a very small number of qualified translators, organization is much easier and vastly more powerful. Let's say you are an MLSP that needs to translate medical documents into Haitian Creole, and that there are only 3 translators in the world qualified to perform such translations. If this is the case, it is almost guaranteed that they know each other. Hell, they probably attended each other's weddings. While this may not be an official labor union, it may as well be, since they are very organized and you have no choice but to work with them. These principles hold true especially for location-dependent work. Nowadays, translation occurs globally, with files being sent all over the globe for completion. However, translation is just one form of language services. It is important to remember that interpreting is still a very local market. There are some projects that can be completed by an over-the-phone interpreter. The vast majority of interpreting work is done in person, and it can be expensive to pay travel expenses to send interpreters wherever they are needed. Since some interpretation jobs require multiple interpreters, it is not uncommon that in any given city, the interpreters have worked together at the same jobs, and so they mostly all know each other. And if they don't know each other, then we can guarantee that they are sharing notes on the best and worst companies to work for. So it is very important to stay off their quote-unquote worst list. While such online and offline communities are a far cry from being organized labor unions, they are nonetheless powerful. They put transparency of information into the hands of CLPs and other suppliers and therefore increase their bargaining power. For an MLSP that relies heavily on engagement with either other LSPs or CLPs, it is absolutely imperative that you are aware of the risk of disregarding such organic communities. It may be rare that such communities actually refuse work or quote-unquote go on strike, but they can powerfully affect your brand equity. Many LSPs have been baffled as to why their supplier costs seem to be slowly increasing over time, only to realize too late it is because their suppliers are telling each other online about how they should not work with you. Formalized Unionization. There are very few formalized labor unions in the language services industry. The low barrier to entry and high level of competition all but ensures that effective unions will never be able to take hold. When unions do exist, they are either for specialized work such as governmental translations that require certain skills and certifications, or for services that overlap with other industries where unionization is more common. Take, for instance, voiceover artists who are part of the actors' guilds and unions from the larger entertainment industry. Competition with suppliers. Whether or not companies directly compete with their suppliers is another factor that affects the bargaining power of suppliers. Essentially, this refers to whether or not it is feasible for a supplier to start selling to their customer's customer. Cut out the middleman, in other words. If this is possible, then it can increase the bargaining power of the suppliers. Consider how Apple works with various retailers to sell their products. In this example, Apple is the supplier for the retailers. Now we're sure these retailers maintain a pretty high level of bargaining power with most of their suppliers, but their relationship with Apple, who do you think wears the pants? Apple, of course. Surely, this is due in part to the high demand for Apple's highly differentiated products, but it's also because Apple has the ability to cut any retailer out of the process completely. Apple sells its products online and in their own stores, meaning that they are competing with their own customer for market share. This direct competition means that Apple holds a disproportionate amount of the bargaining power in its relationship with its customers. We have already demonstrated how low the barriers to entry are in the language services industry and how it can be relatively easy for LSPs to grow and expand their services. Sometimes this means that LSPs who work for other larger LSPs, that is, an SLSP working for an MLSP, will start expanding into services provided by their clients. In other words, they start expanding into the same niche as their customers. Once this happens, then the SLSP doesn't need their customer as much and may start to think they can cut them out and work directly with their clients. Just how MLSPs will sometimes cut out the SLSP and work directly with the CLPs, it is also possible for the SLSP to cut out the MLSP and work directly with the LSB. In such a scenario, where the supplier is able to compete in the same niche as the customer, it should go without saying that the supplier holds a much greater bargaining power. You may be wondering how much this actually happens. Well, although it is entirely theoretically possible, the reality is that it doesn't happen too often. LSPs are usually content to stay within their lane and not invite additional competition by venturing outside of their niche, which brings us nicely into our next conversation on industry rivalry.